So many people have been asking recently, what's the best place to put the jack and the stands without damaging the underside of the car? So in today's video, I thought we'd look at lifting the car up, jacking it up, placing the axle stands, where to put the jack, and so on. I said previously on another video about looking for these markers on the undersides of the skirt or the underside of the body, which basically state where you should be jacking it up with the factory jack. Just about all modern cars have them. And you can see at the back of the Alfa, we've got them here as well on the skirt. If we look at a different car, we've got the same markers again. So these points are okay if you're going to jack it up using the factory jack, which we did in a previous video, where we saw the jack basically go either side of this lip here. But if you want to use something a bit more effective and a bit faster than the factory jack, then what should we be looking at? As I said in that previous video, you can see where the car's been lifted up before without using any protection, and it's obviously damaged this seal here, and we can see just a little bit of a underseal flaking away there. So obviously I'm going to get around to repairing that, but what it's a good demonstration of is that we want to use something that's going to be protective of this. We don't just want to be metal to metal, so we want to use something that's going to basically cushion any impact or rubbing against that hard metal. So for me, to help stop that type of damage, when I'm using these sorts of tools, whether it's a trolley jack or the axle stands, what I've done is invested in these rubber bungs, basically these rubber tops for them. So it's just basically a rubber top that sits on the top of the hard metal stand, sits on there basically, so when the car lowers down onto it, it stops that hard metal clash to clash, and offers a buffer. That seam can just sit in there or wherever it might be, and that stops any more damage. For me, it's important too to make sure to remember to use these sorts of chocks or something behind the wheels to make sure the car's not going to roll anywhere. If you're lifting up the front, then obviously the handbrake should hold the rear wheel, but if you're lifting up the rear, then the front wheels aren't going to be secured by the handbrake or anything. So my driveway, like I've said before, kind of runs downhill slightly, so if I'm lifting up the front there, I always like to try and make sure to pop a chock in behind both the wheels. Just as it comes up, it just stops, even though the handbrake's on, just stops it rolling. And obviously if I'm lifting up the back, then I'm going to put some chocks underneath the front wheels as well. So starting at the front, you're probably asking the question, if I'm lifting the car up with the jack and I'm putting this on the seam under here, when I want to remove the jack and put the axle stand in, how do I put the axle stand where the top of the jack is already? Good question. So clearly we need to put the trolley jack somewhere where the axle stand isn't going to be, somewhere on the underside of the car that's not going to damage it, that's going to be secure and is going to lift it safely. I have previously lifted the car by putting the trolley jack on this cross beam here, basically the chassis rail, which works perfectly well, but I've also started using this point here, basically where you can see this hole just where the end of my finger is. If I move the camera slightly, this point here seems to work really well for me. It's slightly further to the outside, and I think it's actually one of the points, the mounting points, when they build the cars in the factory where the cars are actually lifted up. So let's get the trolley jack in place and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so with the chocks behind the back wheels, I've just got the trolley jack here, basically positioned just underneath that where you can see the hole. If I lift it up slowly, and then from there, once it's in place, you're happy with it, and it's kind of, you've just got that first bite, you're happy that it's centered across that hole, that's when we can then start to lift the car. So now back around this side, we can see obviously the car's well up in the air. Some of you may have noticed as well that as the car was lifting up, it kind of moved that way slightly. That's actually really important to remember when we come to do that side, if we're going to do both sides at once, because the flexing the car moving side to side as you're lifting it up basically means that if the axle stand is sat in here and the car's trying to move this way, it's actually got potential to push the axle stand over. So you really need to remember that. Looking closely now at where the trolley jack is, obviously you can see that rubber bung is doing its job. It's taking up some of the strain of some of the mold of that metal, obviously where it's not perfectly flat, but it's doing a great job so as not to damage anything there. So now I'm going to get the axle stand and just put it into position. Obviously if I wanted the car higher so that I could lift this up and go even higher, you can see that it can obviously go up a lot higher, then I'd be able to just use the trolley jack to lift it up higher. For now, I've got just about everything that I need to lift it up to get it where I want to. So just lining it up nicely with the seal there. There we go. We should now be able to obviously just lower the car down nice and gently onto that. And what we should see hopefully is as the car comes down onto this rubber bung, that this starts to kind of depress, squash up a little bit, which is exactly what we want, because that means it's taking the stress and the pressure away from this metal hitting the metal of the axle stand itself. You might say, why are we not putting the axle stand over here onto this harder chassis beam? Well, that's a good question, but obviously if you're putting the axle stand in the middle, fine perhaps if you're lifting it up just on one side to do some work. Maybe you want to do some work on this silver, for example. But if you're lifting both up and you're doing this side and the other side at the same time, then your weight's kind of all centered on a point in the middle, which makes it more likely that the car could topple over. So if you can get your axle stands out as far to the side of the car as possible, then it's going to be much safer while it's up in the air. Okay, so let's slowly lower this down. And there, with the weight on the axle stand, you can see the trolley jack continues to come down. There we go. And now the car is in the air, sat on the axle stand as high as we need it to be. Spin the front wheel, so it's obviously still up in the air high enough if we wanted to do any work in the wheel arch or anything like that. So now we can take the jack out of the way and take it around the other side. So on this side you can see we've got exactly the same. You can see that hole just there. That's where I'm going to put the trolley jack now. Slide it in, lift it up, and then slide the axle stand in. Just move the camera so that we can see the axle stand over here as well, because what we want to do, we want to make sure that while we're jacking this point up, that we're not going to compromise anything over here. Like I've said, my driveway's on a bit of a slope, so that gradient could have an impact, but I've done this before, so fingers crossed. Let's go for it. So this side's now up in the air, the front tyre is well clear of the floor. The other axle stand looks perfectly fine, so I'm just going to bring in the axle stand for this side. Pop that just underneath where it needs to go to align with the mark on the seam. Again, you see we've gone a bit higher on this side, quite a bit higher. So now just to carefully lower the car down and just keeping an eye on both the stands at the same time as it comes down. Okay, so now we can remove the trolley jack. Just take this out of the way. And there we go. The car's nicely up in the air, nice and safely on those axle stands. We could potentially go a little bit higher, just on both sides, just to make sure that we've got some better clearance underneath the wheels there. I think possibly it looks like it's come down just at a touch in the floor. But yeah, that's basically where I lift the car up from, and I've never had any issues with it. Now let's look at the rears. I've only got 2 axle stands, so I'm going to take these down first, safely get them off. So basically do a complete reverse of what I did before. I'm just going to lift up the other side, take it out, keep an eye on the stands, and then come around this side, lift it up again, take it out and lower it down. So let's look at this point on the rear. Obviously we've got on skirt the same marking that we said about, which would align to the chassis rail just here, or rather the seam, not the chassis rail, and that's where we're going to aim to put our axle stand. But obviously this is some plastic moulding, so we can't put our trolley jack here. We can see chassis beam coming along, which is underneath here. But what we then have just in this recess that we've got here, if I come out a little bit, is this same hole that we saw at the front, and that's where we're going to aim basically to put our jack. You can see probably where a garage has done it before previously here, where they've lifted it up maybe to change a tire or something. So again, I'll make sure that that's cleaned and sealed with some sealant. But that's where we're going to put our trolley jack for now. Like I say, that's where I've done it before previously, never had any issues with it. You can see that I've just put the chocks underneath both the front wheels there, so you can see across the other side, both under there. So if I get this in here, you should be able to see, just to lift it up. A bit difficult to do with the camera in front of me, but this is where this should come up, line up to that point. Again, obviously with the rubber bung on the top of the jack, that just comes in, just aligns. Now we can lift the car. Okay, so with the back wheel firmly off the floor, clearly off the floor, should we say, what we can now do is slide our axle stand in and align it up nicely with that indicator just on the seal there that we can see. So just as it comes in, we'll line it up so it's either side of that seal. So when we lower it down, it's just going to come straight into this groove here, and that should obviously act as a nice buffer, like I say. We can see the rear wheel nicely off the floor, not too high, just enough though that we'll be able to take it off and work on it. Trolley jack is out and the car is firmly on that axle stand. So let's go around and do the other side. So even more with the rears, we need to make sure that while we're lifting the car up, we keep an eye on that side as well. If you've got a nice level ground, probably it wouldn't be so bad, I'm guessing. But like I say, with my gradient and my driveway, sometimes I know that they can just start to lean slightly. So we want to try and mitigate that as much as possible, just by going nice and slowly. So up we go. Now we can bring in the axle stand, line it up nicely, and then slowly lower it down. And this is where it's really important just to keep an eye on both stands. Coming down nice and slowly. If you need to move the axle stand, just slightly in as you go. Obviously just being careful, nice and slowly, just to make sure that it's lined up perfectly with that groove, so you're not going to compromise anything there. As it comes down, just keep your eye. There we go. Watching on the other side as well. Everything looks good over there. Slowly coming down, just taking the slack up. And there we go. So now we've got the back end nicely up in the air. If we hadn't removed the axle stands from the front, obviously the entire car would be off the floor now, but now we've got loads of lovely space. When it comes to doing some of the other things that we need to do on this car, like we said about replacing the springs, maybe refurbishing these exhaust brackets, some of those bushes and so on that we said we've got to do, that's exactly what we're going to be doing, lifting it up nice and squarely like this to give ourselves lots of room. So now to do the exact opposite as we did before. So there we go, just another quick how-to video. Like I say, that's the way I've always done it. Never had any issues, never had any problems. Certainly never had any issues with damaging the underside of the car or anything like that. So yeah, hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully you found something in there that you can take away from it. If you've enjoyed the video, hit subscribe, coming up here now somewhere, hopefully. There's loads more videos on the channel, like I say, loads more videos coming up. I want to just make sure that there's loads of how-tos to really help people, and that's the intent of this channel, really, to help other people do things by me learning how to not do them, perhaps, shall we say. So yeah, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Cheers.